glad you could join me again today. Do you know what the Beatitudes are? Blessed are the poor in spirit, blessed are those that hunger and thirst after righteousness. There's quite a list of them in Matthew chapter 5, but today I want to just talk about the eighth one. So after opening with promises for the poor in spirit, the mourning, the weak, the Beatitudes began recounting beautiful qualities of seeking after righteousness and mercy and purity and wonderful things in our life. Peacemaking is a lovely portion to study as well. But then it turns right toward the end to a rather distasteful and awkward blessing of persecution. In verse 10 it says, "Blessed are they which are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." So blessed means to be happy or to be looked upon by God with favor. And it's saying you are happy and looked upon God by favor when you are under persecution. And we usually take persecution to mean something physical. But this is the promise of God. It defines even the snide comments of others, and he calls those persecution too. You know, he notices when his children are ostracized or abused. He cares. And in his time, he's going to make all things right. We know that. You read the book of Revelation, he will make everything right. So be it slavery or illness or prejudice or ridicule or even martyrdom, God's going to make it right. We can be assured that he's not going to waste our afflictions, as he tells us, but he will bring a blessing out of them for his glory and for our benefit. But then there's a huge qualifier that says persecuted for righteousness' sake. And the blessing of this beatitude is not for those who are unkind or who disagree over a doctrine or a way of life. It is not there. It is not there when the struggle is based on prejudice or pride, if you understand what I'm saying. The blessing is reserved for those who face persecution because of or for righteousness' sake. And there's the difference. And what does that look like? I got to thinking about Daniel. He's a really good example. He refused to eat the king's meat because he purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself, right? He wanted to stay true to his Jewish dietary requirements. And for him, this was a matter of righteousness. It was important to the Jews that they stayed away from the unclean meats and the things that were against their dietary laws. And then later he was thrown into the lion's den because he prayed, right? He continued to pray. And Joseph is another example. He refused to lie with Potiphar's wife, and that got him thrown into prison for righteousness' sake, for standing true to what he knew was morally correct. And you know, we can also suffer on the other side. We can suffer as a murderer, a thief, an evildoer, or a busybody in other men's matters, it tells us in 1 Peter 14. But these are not righteous acts, and they make void that promise of blessing that comes from the Beatitude. So we need to consider carefully then what is causing our persecution. Is it the working of God in our lives, the challenge of obedience and devotion to him, or is it of our own making? And when we follow the example of Christ, 1 Peter 2:19-23 tells us this: "For this is thankworthy, for if a man for conscience toward God endure grief, suffering wrongfully, for what glory is it if when you be buffeted for your faults, you take it patiently? But if when you do well and you suffer for it, you take it patiently, this is accepted with God. For even hereunto were ye called, because Christ also suffered for us, leaving us an example, that we should follow in his steps, who did no sin, neither was guile found in his mouth, who when he was reviled, reviled not again, and when he suffered, he threatened not, but he committed himself to him that judges righteously." So if persecution comes your way because of a righteous cause, and you take it patiently, you're showing forth the example of Christ. He showed us what it was like to face persecution. But if you suffer for your own doing, then there is no glory. And Christ's example is to face persecution without striking back. And why? Because of that last phrase, God is the final judge. He committed himself to him that judges righteously. God will judge us on how we deal with the persecution in our life. And we needn't be surprised when persecutions come. It's a part of life. You have only to read the history of Britain and Europe, for example, to see that martyrs abound. And even today, in places around the world, Christians are being called upon to suffer for Christ, to suffer for righteousness' sake, and even give their lives. So why would we think that we should be exempted or excused from persecution? Why would we not believe that we would be called upon to stand for our faith and for righteousness' sake? Dear friend, this may be coming very soon. Are we afraid? Are we afraid to be laughed at? Are we ashamed of Christ? Do we so desire the world's applause that we would willingly lower biblical standards and commands? I hope not. So just think about it. Let the world scoff. Let them talk. Maintain your integrity and look beyond the current suffering to the glory of heaven. That was David's method that we talked about. It's Christ's example, to look beyond the current persecution to the promise to come, to maintain our integrity and not fall prey to the temptation for revenge or self-executed justice. And how could people do that? How could we do that? We can do that, and others have done that through centuries because they believed in God's promise to make all things even in the end. Hebrews chapter 12, verse 1 to 4 is a good passage for us to consider here. It says, "Wherefore, seeing we also are compassed about with so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and the sin which doth so easily beset us, and let us run with patience the race that is set before us, looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is set down at the right hand of the throne of God. For consider him that endured such contradiction of sinners against himself, lest ye be weary and faint in your minds. You have not yet resisted unto blood, striving against sin." I love that bit. I've not resisted unto blood, striving against sin. Have you? Oh, sure, people have laughed or maybe mocked at me, or maybe things have gone past me because I was a Christian, but I've not given my lifeblood for Christ, not yet. When we look beyond the hardships of today to the benefits of the future and the sure promises of God, we can find that joy that this verse that talks about, looking unto Jesus, who for the joy that was set before him, the joy that gave him the strength and resolve to face the cross on our behalf. And we can run with patience and refuse to allow anger and hardship to sidetrack us from our appointed race. When we keep our eyes on Jesus as our example, when we look to see all that he endured for us, it puts our struggle into perspective. We aren't being asked to carry the sin of the world on the cross. And that is a great blessing because we could not do that. So, dear friend, being persecuted is not something that we relish, I know, but it's something that God can bless when we manage it by faith and in accordance to the instruction of his word. I believe we are wise to study this subject, that we might be better prepared for the future and be a faithful steward of the grace of God. Well, let me close with the two verses that follow this beatitude. Verse 11 and 12 read, "Blessed are ye, when men shall revile you and persecute you and say all manner of evil against you falsely for my sake. Rejoice," he says, "and be exceeding glad, for great is your reward in heaven. For so persecuted they the prophets which were before you." You see, it really isn't such an awkward blessing when the reward comes attached with it. I'll see you next week.